communities that did not return to Jerusalem. She lives in the town of Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. We also know that Esther was an orphan. And from that piece of information, I imagine that her life had been complicated and involved great sadness. A relative, Mordecai, took her into his home like a daughter and loved her and looked after her. And he had an official position in the royal palace. The king of Persia at this time is partial to a long banquet feast. Long means over 180 days. That's taking the long lunch to a whole new level. That's a note for you lunch club people that get together after church. This is the new long lunch, 180 days. It's during this long feast that we get introduced to Esther. When the king is drunk and his wife doesn't respond to his request to come so he can show her off, which is fair enough, he throws a beauty pageant. And that is where we meet Esther as an entry in the pageant. She doesn't reveal that she is a Jew. She wins. And the king becomes obsessed with her and her beauty and makes her Queen Esther. Her relative Mordecai, as we heard in the Lego story, just happens to overhear a couple of palace guards plotting to kill the king and tells Esther, who in turn tells the king, and Mordecai is credited with saving the king's life. Enter stage right, a horrible man called Haman. He's a character that seems to get the king to do all the things he wants, like have everyone bow down to him. A greedy, proud, and selfish man. Mordecai refuses to bow down, and Haman finds out he's a Jew. And then he convinces the king to decree that all the Jews will be killed. I have to say, this king seems to make policy on the run, and from the last person he speaks to. But they hold another banquet to celebrate that. It's fair to say this king did a lot of eating and drinking and a lot of decision-making while he was under the influence. Now, at that part of the story, let's hear from the book of Esther, chapter 4. Dave's going to read to us chapter 4 in Esther. If you've got your Bibles there, you can look that up. Or if not, it's going to be on the screen.
When Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth.
I can't hear you, Dave, if you're talking. Oh, we can.
I'm just going to mute Sandy so we can't hear her. Let's start again. When Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went into the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, since the law prohibited anyone wearing sackcloth from entering the king's gate. There was great mourning among the Jewish people in every province where the king's command and edict had reached. They fasted, wept, and lamented, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther's female servants and her eunuchs came and reported the news to her, and the queen was overcome with fear. She sent clothes for Mordecai to wear so that he would take off his sackcloth, but he did not accept them. Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who attended her, and dispatched him to Mordecai to learn what he was doing and why. So Hathach went to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened, as well as the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay the royal treasury for the slaughter of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa ordering their destruction, so that Hathach might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and command her to approach the king, implore his favour, and plead with him personally for her people. Hathach came and repeated Mordecai's response to Esther. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to tell Mordecai, "All the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned, the death penalty. Unless the king extends the gold scepter, allowing that person to live, I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, "Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, "Go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. After that, I will go to the king, and even if it is against the law, if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him.
Thanks for that, Dave. You can feel the suspense in this chapter. Messages going back and forth. And here is Esther willing to try and save her people, God's people. When we read this chapter, some things about Esther and her character become obvious. Her willingness to sacrifice. She could have chosen what would have seemed an easier path, to absorb herself in the Persian community that she was part of and use the power she had as queen for herself. But she dealt with the opportunity her power gave her in a different way. She responded with humility and obedience to God, to stand up for God and his people. When we read about characters in the Bible like Esther that are part of God's amazing plan, they can seem very far from our own experience. And as much as I love Prince Harry, I'm probably never going to be a queen. But we can relate to Esther's feelings. We can understand the feelings she had. She had fear. We have fear. She questioned the plan. We do that. She asked for help. We do that. I know I can relate to that. And as we hear her respond to Mordecai, it's clear she had some hesitation. But everyone knows if someone approaches the king without being asked, you will be put to death unless he extends his gold scepter. And by the way, it's been 30 days since he's even asked to see me. And Mordecai responds with confidence in God's purpose. If you remain silent at this time, relief will come from somewhere else. And he challenges her. Who knows? But that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. I do feel a little bit like, thanks, Mordecai, but you're not actually the one who's going to go before the king and maybe be put to death. Thanks for your confidence. But Mordecai is confident in God's plan that the Jews will be rescued from this situation by God. And he challenges Esther that she might well be God's chosen instrument right for this very time. And Esther responds, "Get everyone together and fast for me. Do it for 3 days. And I will do the same, and my attendants will do the same, and then I will go to the king. And if I perish, I perish." This is amazing confidence and willingness from Esther. The time of fasting would have included prayer. No doubt she had fears, but she knew that she needed to bring it all before God in fasting and prayer and then act. And she was courageous and brave. So as we heard what happened when she went before the king, we heard in the story, good news, the king was okay to see her, and he even asked what he could give her. And so she invites the king and Haman to a special banquet where she will tell the king her request. And as we heard in the Lego story, the night before, the king can't sleep. So he asks for the record of his reign and everything he'd done to be read to him. I'm not sure I would want a book about me to me when I'm feeling sleepless. I think that would actually make me feel more sleepless if we read out everything I'd done. Anyway, during that reading, he's reminded that Mordecai had saved him from the assassination plot of 2 of his guards. And the king wonders whether he thanked Mordecai. And so the next morning, as we heard, Just as Haman's kind of entering to enact his plan to kill Mordecai, the king does the opposite and orders Haman to publicly praise Mordecai. And that's the beginning of Haman's downfall. Haman the baddie gone, which is good. And when Esther's banquet starts, she reveals that she's a Jew and that the decree that Haman had in place would mean she would be murdered along with Mordecai and all the Jews. And in response, the king, again drunk, decrees that Haman be murdered. And the king grants Esther's request. The day that the Jews were going to die, they could now protect themselves and avenge their enemies. And there was much rejoicing and celebrating among the Jews. They became feared by other nations, and Mordecai became powerful. And there's more killing and some impaling as well, but we won't go into that right now. Mordecai wrote down everything that had happened in letters and sent them to the provinces near and far for them to celebrate this day annually in every generation. Celebrate that they were saved from their enemies. And we see that God's plan for his people to be a great nation continues. It was not stopped. Remember that promise that he gave to Abraham? I will bless the whole world through you. I will be your God forever, and I will always be with you. We see that here in this story. Did you notice that God wasn't mentioned once in the chapter that we read in chapter 4? No word God in that chapter. And in fact, God is not mentioned in the whole book of Esther in the Bible, which is strange. But that gives us an opportunity. Gives us an opportunity to actually look carefully at what God is doing here in Esther. He is a silent character in the book of Esther. God is a silent character in the book. The story of Esther includes God's work and his presence all the way through. Going back through the story, he was at work as Esther was the girl chosen out of all those other girls. She was chosen at the beauty pageant. He was at work as Mordecai overhears the guards plotting. He was at work when the king is sleepless at night and remembers that Mordecai saved him. God makes sure the king responds positively to Esther when she approaches him. And God was at work in both Mordecai and Esther and their role in saving the people. We actually see God all the way through this book. He is not absent. And yes, it's Esther's story, but it's actually all about God, his work, and the fulfillment of his promises. So what for us? What can we learn from this faithful woman who was obedient in working for God and his people? Got 3 points that I think we can learn from Esther and her story. Firstly, God has a plan, and he uses all types of people and circumstances to make his plan happen. So that means you and me. As we see in Esther, she wasn't perfect. She certainly wasn't following all of the Jewish laws, but that didn't mean God couldn't use her. And we aren't perfect, but God can use us. We can get stuck, bogged down sometimes in wondering about God's plan and how he's using people. I know I can. But whatever our situation, at school, at work, at church, with friends, relationships, if we're sick, even when we're well, God is sovereign. That means he is in control. Whoever seems to be in the control of the situation, sometimes we think, why is that person in control of that situation? We need to remember that God's got it. He is sovereign, and that's really good news. We can trust him in a hopeless situation. We can trust him regardless of the situation, just like Esther did. She trusted God. Think about your life at the moment. Is there something you feel is hopeless? Is there something you're confused about? Turn to God. Trust him. Secondly, God is involved in our lives, and we can be confident in his purpose. He was fulfilling his purpose in this story of Esther. He was saving his people through Esther. He saved us through Jesus, and then he uses us to save other people. A recent song that I like that was playing this morning as you arrived online, if we can call it that, arrived at church online, that sums up the way God worked in the story of Esther and is working all the years since and today in our lives. The words say, "You are way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness." That is who you are. Even though I don't see it, you're working. You never stop working. And I love those words because often we can't see it. And like in the book of Esther, we don't see the word God there. But that doesn't mean he's not working. We might not see people in our lives talking about Jesus all the time, and we might feel he's not working in a situation, but he is still working even if we don't see it. He was part of Esther's life and her story. He was right there, and he is right here with us. Thirdly, we need to be willing to be used by God, and that includes sacrifice. Esther was willing. She could have made the story about her, but she didn't. She wanted God's people to survive, and she was willing to sacrifice to make that happen. Sometimes we want to make the story or the situation about us and what we want. It's easy to do. The way Esther made her story about saving God's people is a really good example to us. And actually, we have an even better example than that in Jesus. He's the even better example of sacrifice. His whole life led to his death for us and our sins. He died and was separated from God so that we can be sons and daughters of the King. So when we decide to follow Jesus, we're part of his family, his royal family. So see, I do get to wear a crown after all. In 1 Peter in the New Testament, we are told that we are a royal priesthood. And it's really appropriate that we celebrate that, the sacrifice that brings us into royalty. At the very end of Esther's story in chapter 9, verse 28, the Jews are asked to celebrate. These days should be remembered in every generation by every family, remembering when their sadness turned to joy. And for us too, we need to celebrate in our small families and our bigger church family. We need to remember, we need to rejoice, we need to encourage, we need to appreciate. We can actually do all those things. It's not a hard action list, but we actually need to remember to do that. In celebrating Jesus, we get a taste of heaven. And when we celebrate, we also remember God's forgiveness and love for me and for you. Esther's life was complicated. She wasn't perfect. She had fears. She had questions. But she identified with God and his people. She took her concerns to him and she acted with courage. She trusted God, and God was at work in her life. The same for us. We need to look for God. He's there. He's faithful. He wants to save us, just like he saved Esther. He sent his son Jesus to save us, and he continues to work in all of us and our lives. And we get to remember and celebrate that every week normally when we're together at the school for church by having bread and grape juice together. And we're going to do that again today. And we get to celebrate and thank him for his great sacrifice. That is more than we could imagine and brings us into his royal family. I think Anthony's going to do that for us now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.